website or YouTube channel, and probably with the YWCA and Diversity Action Team as well. The parts of the event may be recorded and used by media outlets if somebody is here from the media. And at the end of the program at 7 p.m., our partner members will give announcements, and then all other participants are welcome to give announcements in the parking lot, as well as have free reign in an unmoderated discussion at 7:30 without worry about being recorded. Finally, I would like to recognize that we are meeting on the ancestral lands of Native nations. In Wisconsin, there are 11 federally recognized Native American sovereign nations. We acknowledge these indigenous communities who have stewarded this land through generations, and we pay respect to their elders past and present. And with that, it's time to start. I'll turn it over to Amy.
Thank you, Neil, and welcome everyone for this part one of our immigration special. So we have 3 video clips this evening that we'll be watching, and we'll break and have conversation after each of them. But I just wanted to set up the flow of the evening before we get started. The first video clip is entitled, "How Did the Haitian Revolution Change the World?" It is a 3.5-minute clip, but there is so much to unpack, and you'll see that once you view the clip. And then we'll move to how the US and France, not exclusively, but the US and France, how they made Haiti poor. And then the final clip that we'll end with, after discussing the history of the Haitian Revolution in Saint-Domingue, which is now known as Haiti, some current issues dealing with Haitian migrants, and we'll watch a video clip that addresses the US deportation of Haitian migrants from the US-Texas border, from the Mexico-US border in Texas. All right, so I will get this first clip started, and then we'll open the floor for discussion.
I want you to think of the world in 1794. Everywhere you look, there's slavery in the Atlantic world. Everywhere. North America, Caribbean, Latin America, particularly Brazil. There is no anti-slavery movement that has succeeded in these places. Plantations are the order of the day. Saint-Domingue is considered the pearl of the Antilles. It is the richest plantation and the richest colony in the entire colonial world. Everybody knows about it. The Dutch know about it. They have newspapers that write articles about it. The British write newspaper articles about it. Newspapers in Scotland were writing about it. The German newspapers were writing about it. Everybody was preoccupied because this was the richest colony of the world. This was the Antilles. This was the colony that I would argue that the colonial fantasy existed upon, to the extent where rich women from Paris would send their clothes to be washed in Saint-Domingue in a certain river because it had a certain quality in it. I mean, the fantasy that existed at that moment. So then you think of that world, and then think of the slaves then getting rid of slavery in 1794. And then think of the reverberations of that across the world. It created what became known as the Haitian fear. That is, we could not have this again. Napoleon made it absolutely clear. He said the key to what is happening in Saint-Domingue, the colony, is not the commercial success, is not economics, is not even politics, he says. He says we have to get rid of the specter, and here I quote him, the specter of the blacks. What's the specter of the blacks? The specter of the blacks is black sovereignty and against slavery. So you think, therefore, how that revolution shakes up the entire world, a world built on colonialism and a world built on slavery. And then you ask yourself, okay, if that is so, what is the most important revolution of this period? Is it the French Revolution that declares rights of citizenship, citizens and equal rights, but continues a colonial project, not just in the Caribbean, but also in parts of Africa? Is it the American Revolution of 1776 that continues, that does not get rid of slavery, but just talks about political independence? Is it the English Revolution of 1648, in which parliamentary democracy is established? Or is it the Haitian Revolution, the dual Haitian Revolution, in which what? In which the question of slavery, which was the dominant form of domination of people in the Atlantic world, is gotten rid of. Is that not the most important and radical revolution of the period? And it is done by formerly enslaved people.
All right, so don't worry if you would like to watch that link again after this program ends. I will put the link in the chat, but I'm simply going to open the floor to responses to the content in the video we just watched.
Is there any way that you can give a summary? It was hard for me to catch a lot of that. So is there, I believe that it was just they're referring to the fact that the abolishing of the slaves was the most important part of that period.
If I could give it a shot, Amy.
Sure, Neil.
What I heard him say was that the reason that that Haiti's revolution was so important was because people were afraid of other slaves revolting and were concerned that their own colonial enterprises might be affected if their slaves revolted. That was one thing I heard him say.
Definitely the fear of revolts from other enslaved people was prevalent in that. But just the fear of Black sovereignty, of Black liberation, the audacity of that thought had to be quelched. So yes, there's lots in there. And also this revolution didn't have the hypocrisy of the others, where you want political independence, but you have people as chattel slaves. So the hypocrisy there was not, did not mar the Haitian Revolution, was another important point in that clip. And I did drop that in the chat. Again, it's about a 3.5-minute clip, so feel free to watch that after the program because there is a lot to unpack there. If anyone else would like to chime in, please feel free to put a question mark in the chat. That way we won't be speaking over each other. I can call on you. If you would like to type your question out, you can also do that. Anything that you send to me directly, I will share the content, but not the author. Steve, go ahead, please.
Just some comments on what happened with the Haiti Revolution and international relations. The United States refused to recognize Haiti. It was held up by several Southern senators who said, this is just no way we can recognize them. The financial crisis that was forced upon Haiti after that was just a way to suppress it and to dismiss it and to make it as irrelevant as they possibly could, because the notion of slaves revolting was unacceptable.
Thank you, Steve. And that is a perfect segue for our next video. But before that, we'll hear from Susan, please. Susan, are you able to unmute yourself? All right, well, we'll move on to the second video. And Susan, if you're able or would like to share, just drop another question mark in the chat. Oh, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I unmuted. Well, I guess I wanted to verify. Did I hear him say that at one point Haiti was one of the wealthiest colonies?
V.
It was the wealthiest?
If I may make a comment, the wealth coming out of Haiti was greater than all 13 of the American colonies at that time. Sugar, coffee, and some other indigo, things like that were just made it the wealthiest colony in the world.
And that's and that's prior to the revolution in 1794 and 1804, right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you for stopping to get that clarification. So let's move into the second video clip. I'm so appreciative of all the comments and they have set up a perfect segue. So I will share my screen.
Disaster, now political violence.
Mention Haiti, and this is what you'll likely hear.
From poverty, natural disaster, now political violence.
Every report about Haiti has to include the line that it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere.
But hold on for a second. Something's missing in this conversation, right?
We need to be all thinking about the relationship of what we're calling poverty in Haiti and the relation to the richness of the rest of the world. And how did the rest of the world get so rich?
Let's start with France. Imagine if you were enslaved and after fighting for your independence, you were forced to spend the next couple of generations paying compensation to those who colonized you.
Reparations for slaveholders is a new one for me.
That is exactly what happened to Haiti.
This is punishment for their unwillingness to remain under the yoke of slavery.
In 1697, France and Spain ended a war with each other by dividing up the Spanish colony Hispaniola. Through the labor of enslaved indigenous and Black people, Saint-Domingue became the world's most profitable colony, exporting sugar, coffee, and indigo.
Enslaved people in Saint-Domingue suffered some of the harshest and cruelest slave punishments in the entire Atlantic world. Life expectancy was extremely low, such that at the moment of the Haitian Revolution breaking out in August 1791, the vast majority of enslaved people had only been on the island for 2 or 3 years. They were from whatever nation that they had been captive and brought over, and they basically said no.
Self-liberated Africans led the Haitian Revolution and ended slavery in present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. After 12 years of fighting the French colonial power, which had tried to reintroduce slavery, the formerly enslaved people of Saint-Domingue officially declared their independence and renamed their country Haiti. Many countries, including the United States, refused to recognize Haitian independence in fear of slave rebellions. And France refused to accept Haiti's independence unless Haiti paid 150 million francs as so-called compensation for lost revenues from slavery. That was around 10 times Haiti's annual budget. But Haiti couldn't decline the indemnity request since the French came ready for war, carrying more than 500 cannons on their ships. Articles from that period show that the French king knew the Haitian government wouldn't be able to repay the debt, which decimated Haiti's economy. Haitians had extremely high taxes, and most of the tax revenue was paid for the indemnity. This left the education system, public infrastructures, and healthcare underdeveloped. Agricultural land was also depleted to grow cash crops that paid for the debt, but couldn't feed the country. It took Haiti 122 years to pay off its debt and required taking high interest loans.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy to say that Haiti is poor and Haiti must be poor. And I think the better question whenever a people, an entire people is characterized as poor with this word, is to say, not why are they poor, but why aren't you?
But it's not just the French who have played a role in Haiti's misery.
So the United States has intervened in Haitian affairs quite a lot.
President Moïse's assassination in 2021 left some Haitian officials calling for US intervention, but not everyone agrees.
The only way that that could ever even have a fruitful outcome would be if it was because they were in dialogue with the Haitian people for the first time, because that is not what usually happens. That's not what happens at all. They dialogue with the people claiming power, and some negotiation is struck between those vying for power and the United States government. There's a lot of people saying, no, we don't want the United States to come and intervene again, because this is, again, a repetition of history.
The history that Professor Doubt is talking about involves the United States' 19-year occupation of Haiti, an occupation that killed thousands of Haitians. Following the assassination of Haiti's president in 1915, US President Woodrow Wilson's administration invaded Haiti to protect US investments. Then, they forced the election of a new Haitian president who would protect American interests in the country. Racist and fear-mongering rhetoric was used to justify the move. The occupation ensured that the US prioritized its own interests in Haiti over what was best for Haitians. The US occupation ended in 1934 after local dissent and rebellion grew too costly for the US to control. But even after the occupation, the United States continued to play a role in the internal affairs of Haiti. In 1957, the US government threw its support behind a Haitian dictator, François Duvalier. Duvalier and his successor, aka his son Jean-Claude, ate up aid from the United States in exchange for their strong anti-communist stand at the height of the Cold War. Haitian uprisings ended Duvalier Jr.'s rule and led to Haiti choosing its democratically elected leader, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, in 1990. But within a year, Aristide's government was toppled by a coup. Not only was one of the leaders of the coup on the CIA's payroll, but the US had set up and funded the Haitian military and National Intelligence Service, which both played key roles in the coup. Ousted Aristide returned to his second presidency in 2001, and again was forced out of office by a coup that he claimed the US had orchestrated. And after that, President Obama's cabinet pressured a Haitian presidential candidate to withdraw in 2010.
We see reports coming out of various civil society organizations saying that Haitians have lost faith in the electoral process because it doesn't reflect their actual concerns.
And that brought us to the 2016 Haitian presidential election, where late President Moïse was elected with an extremely low voter turnout, but US backing. In February 2021, Moïse refused to step down at the end of his term. The US once again backed him while thousands of Haitian protesters took to the streets.
Many Haitians are saying, we want to try actual Haitian democracy, where the Haitian people, not just the elite and the bourgeoisie and the business interests, get to have a say and determine the direction and future of the country.
It's clear that Haiti's poverty and political instability has long been influenced and shaped by foreign players. So, knowing this, where does Haiti go from here?
We have never been able to see what could happen in this particular Black country without meddling and interference. We should try something new in the United States, and that is back off and back away and let the Haitian people determine their own future.
All right, so again, a lot to unpack in the clip. I think the second or third time I watched it, I jotted down some notes. So as you're processing, I'm just going to read off some of the top line things that stood out for me. And then I definitely open the floor for everyone to share. So the first thing was, why is Haiti always referred to as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere? And I had never really given it much thought until I heard that question. And then I'm like, that is a repeated message. So my question to that would be, who does that benefit? Another thing that stood out was that this was Haitian punishment for its unwillingness to remain under the yoke of slavery. Then the Haitian Revolution for 12 years, the indemnity tax or fee of 150 million franc, the high taxes to pay that indemnity of the people. So the taxes going to pay this debt, I'll put in air quotes, and not going to things like feeding the people and for infrastructure, for education, for healthcare, etc. I have a few more items on my list, but I feel like I'm being greedy. So I am going to pause and open the floor. Neil, is that a current question mark in the chat, or is that one a little older?
It's older, and in fact, I was just going to comment on the very topic that this past video showed.
Okay. So I received a message, if Haiti is so poor, why do we continue to meddle so much? What is behind the interference? So that is a question that was posed. If anyone would like to respond to that or to participate with your own comment or question. And I think what might be behind the question is, what do we have to gain from interference if Haiti is so poor? If I am incorrect, please do message me and provide clarification, but I think that's the sentiment of the question. Okay, I got confirmation, yes. I think that's something to definitely think about. And does that have historical ties? All right, Steve has a question mark. Please go ahead and unmute.
I hate to talk so much, but I've been to Haiti several times and experienced some of the realities there. One thing is just an example, a Levi's factory in Wanamint, Haiti, which is right on the Dominican border along the Massacre River. You can do a Google search about Massacre River and find out what happened there in the 30s with the Dominican Republic. The Levi's factory was pretty much a company store that was exploiting the labor like crazy. The people that worked there could buy their lunch there, and then that would be taken away from their salary. They would be doing piecework, so you know, if they didn't meet their quotas, they would not be paid as much. There has been continued international exploitation of Haitians. At one point in time, most of the baseballs in the country were, in our country, were manufactured in Haiti. I'm not sure if that's still true or not, but there's a continuation of that. There is also a very stratified class structure, caste structure, really, in Haiti that plays one side against another, and there has just been a mess of foreign intervention over and over again to, quote unquote, restructure the debt or to force debt payments by other countries that has just gone on forever. If you want to go back to the 1915 invasion and into the 30s by the US control, an old book to look at is War is a Racket by Smedley Butler. He was the most decorated Marine, and he in history, at least to that point in the 30s. And Smedley Butler said, you know, it was all a con. All we did was protect the fruit interests, the American interests in other ways, and things like that. War is the Con is just a great little read. Anyway, I'll try to be quiet. Thank you.
Steve, you don't have to make any such promise. I appreciate your input. I'm multitasking right now. I Googled the book you just referenced, so I am dropping that in the chat in case anyone would like to pick that up. Thank you for those comments from your lived experience. Much appreciated. Is there anything from the video that surprised you, that was completely new, that is currently challenging to you, that you would like to share? I'm going to pause. Feel free to send a direct message, put a question mark in the chat. I'll call on you so you can unmute. Neil, go ahead.
Okay, now I can unmute. Just, I was struck by how many times the United States has interfered with Haiti's sovereignty. Not just the 15 years of occupation, but also one coup after another, and how we chose a dictator, a fairly violent dictator, as I recall, just because he was anti-communist. Just the total of those things just really bothers me, and I can't help but think that it's related to the very beginnings of Haiti and the fears that the United States had of a former slave colony.
Thank you for those comments. There are a couple items in the chat. Kendra, so is it true that US cooperations benefit from cheap labor without being regulated? That would definitely not be surprising. Janet has also put in the chat, has there ever been an effort to recolonize Haiti beyond the US interference over the years? A formal recolonization, no, not that I'm aware of, but just by a different name. So you don't have to use the same tactics to get similar outcomes when it comes to exploitation. Katie putting in the chat, and I'm just reading these because I recognize everyone doesn't have their chat open. How hypocritical of the US to interfere in elections when they're trying to run a democratic election. Yes, unfortunately, hypocrisy doesn't always trump self-interest. So one thing that I would like to point out, hopefully you picked up from the video clip, unfortunately, this interference in Haitian political world is not just a Democratic or a Republican thing. Both parties have had a hand to play in this, and this will be a really great time to remind everyone that YWCA Rock County and the Diversity Action Team of Rock County are non-political, are nonpartisan, and our Friends at Community Action are apolitical. All right, so we have one additional video clip. It's about 8 minutes long, and then I have a list of things that I want us to discuss.
Amy?
Yes.
Nancy Stab had a question mark.
Oh, thank you, Neil. I didn't scroll down. Nancy, please unmute.
Well, I was just going to make a comment about the U.S. interfering in Haitian politics. We've done this a lot in Central and South America, Nicaragua, Panama, Chile, and all in the name of fighting communism. But that's not my main question. Was as I looked at the map and I saw the island and saw that actually Haiti is a really small part of that island, and the other country there, the Dominican Republic, I was wondering about that. Were they not required to pay reparations to France? Why haven't they had the kind of interference in their affairs that Haiti seems to have had? The revolution in 1794 affected the entire island, did it not?
It affected Saint-Domingue, which was renamed Haiti.
Which affected that portion of the island. The rest of the island stayed a clone. Okay, that answers my question.
All right. So
the rest of the island was controlled by Spain.
Okay, thank you.
Dominican Republic.
And it remained a place where the enslaved people made the money, did the production. Is that right? It was a slave colony, an enslaved colony for Spain.
It was not nearly to the extent that Haiti was, in terms of, yeah, the split in terms of where the wealth was coming from and where the products and what had been established was the French and then the Haitian side.
Thanks for clearing that up for me.
of Del Rio, Texas, are the crisis on the U.S. southern border deepens tonight. Thousands of Haitian migrants who descended on the town of Del Rio, Texas, are now being deported. Thousands remain encamped under a bridge in dire conditions. And most of those sent home return to a chaotic Haiti, reeling from one disaster after another. There are also major developments in Congress touching on the fate of U.S. immigration policy more broadly. Yamiche Alcindor begins with the situation in Del Rio.
Today in Del Rio, Texas, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas saw firsthand the tense situation there. He pledged to continue immigration enforcement while also dealing with the migrants' humanitarian needs.
It is extraordinarily challenging. As I said at the outset, it is very, very heartbreaking. We are surging resources not only to ensure the security of this area, the security of the community, but also the well-being of the migrants themselves.
In recent days, the crowd of migrants in the Texas border town swelled to more than 14,000. They sheltered under and near this Del Rio bridge. They had been waiting to be processed, but in squalid and sweltering conditions, and with food and supplies constantly running short.
There is not enough food to give to everybody who is inside there. We need to get out of the camp to look for food.
Many of them are migrants from Haiti who fear returning there right now, both in the wake of the earthquake this summer that jolted the country and in the aftermath of the assassination of Haiti's president. Over the weekend, U.S. authorities stepped up their efforts to slow the flow of migrants to that part of the border. Agents on horseback with rope in hand aggressively confronted some migrants who were trying to make their way to the encampment. Photos and videos of the scene, as well as the mass deportations, have led to intense backlash. The White House press secretary called the images horrific. Is it the president's stance or the White House's stance that whoever these border agents are using what seems to be whips on migrants that they would be fired or at least never be able to do that again?
Of course, they should never be able to do it again. I don't know what the circumstances would be. It's obviously horrific, the footage. I don't have any more information on it, so let me venture to do that, and we'll see if there's more to convey.
The U.S. has started deporting many of the migrants back to Haiti and other countries en masse. On Sunday, more than 300 deported migrants landed in the Haitian capital of Port-au-Prince.
I left Haiti to go find a better future because here in Haiti, all of us young people, despite finishing our studies, cannot get any work. We are on the streets with nothing. That is why there are many youngsters on the street. There are many criminals. It is because the authorities do not think about us.
Today, back in Del Rio, a DHS official said that the encampment there has started to shrink. Mayorkas added that the agency is still working to ramp up deportation flights.
And we turn now to Yamiche at the White House, and Lisa Desjardins is here with me in the studio. So Yamiche, to you first. You have been covering this crisis in Haiti. You've also been talking to human rights activists on the ground there in Texas. What are they telling you and about all of this, and how is the White House reacting?
Well, both human rights activists and the White House describe what the situation that's playing out in Texas with these migrants, mostly of Haitian descent, as heartbreaking. Now, human rights activists and specifically Haitian American activists, they say that this is really the Biden administration treating these migrants cruelly and inhumanely. I've been talking to a lot of people who are very angry and say President Biden promised Haitian Americans in particular when he was trying to win their votes, but Haitians overall around the country, that he was going to treat people in a more dignified way than his predecessor, former President Trump. But there are a lot of people tonight saying these images prove that President Biden is not doing that and not keeping his word. Now, I should also note that there are human rights activists who say that sending people back into Haiti, a country that is facing so many crises, from gang violence to, of course, the aftermath of the assassination of the president and the aftermath of the earthquake, that it is simply not the right thing to do. One activist put it this way. She told me, sending people back into Haiti is like sending children into a burning house. That said, the Haitian government officially is saying we can take these folks, but the head of the Haitian National Migration Office, he said that he would like to see a pause in these deportations if possible. The White House, though, is saying that there's not going to be a pause, that this is what needs to happen, that these deportation flights will continue, and that people do not have the right to remain in the United States, even though there are a lot of people, including activists, who say that there is due process here and that these migrants should be allowed to be able to file for asylum in this country. But of course, under Title 42, which is a Trump era rule, people are being sent back under the idea of a public health crisis and saying that the fact that the United States simply cannot absorb these people at this time.
And meanwhile, as all this is going on, Lisa, you've been reporting on this development on Capitol Hill that could affect millions of undocumented immigrants who came to this country as children. Remind us of what happened.
Everyone following the Dreamers situation, those who are here on temporary protected status, millions and millions of immigrants, a major decision in the last day. This surrounds budget reconciliation, that big word we've been talking about that is really Democrats' best chance to pass their most kind of controversial, difficult legislation. Let me remind people what we're talking about. First of all, budget reconciliation is the process by which you just need 51 votes to get something through the Senate, not 60. Democrats would like to use that to include immigration because they don't have 60 votes for immigration reform, but they may get 51. Now, it has to have a budgetary effect is the thing. Okay, so who decides whether any piece of legislation has enough of a budgetary effect? I can hear our viewers, some of them saying it out loud. The Senate parliamentarian, she issued a ruling to Senate leaders last night, and in it, she said, that's Elizabeth McDonough, the parliamentarian, she wrote, giving this legal permanent status to these undocumented immigrants would give these persons freedom to work, freedom to live openly in our society. Changing the law to clear the way to that status is tremendous and enduring policy change that dwarfs its budgetary impact. Essentially, she's saying, you're trying to get around the purpose of budget reconciliation to do large policy changes, and I'm not going to allow that. It does not fit with this process. That is a body blow to what Democrats hope to do. It is a win for conservatives who want to block it.
And Lisa, what does it mean overall for immigration reform broadly going forward?
It depends on who you speak with. Those activists I talked to today still hold out hope that there might be some kind of window. Democrats in the Senate will try some other kind of maneuvers that we may talk about in coming days. But this was their main form of attacking this issue. Think of it as a political wall. And now the space, that this narrow opening is even smaller.
So back to you, Yamiche, you now not only have this crisis on the border, you have what's gone on at the Capitol. How is the White House looking at all of this?
Well, the White House says that President Biden is still very much dedicated to having a sort of humane and fixed immigration process, and that the officials told me today he inherited this broken immigration system and wants to see it fixed. That being said, the White House officials, a number of them today said that they were, quote, deeply disappointed at the Senate parliamentarians' ruling that this immigration, this path to citizenship, couldn't go into the reconciliation bill. That being said, the White House says they're hoping that maybe senators can find a way to put it back into that bill, or that immigration reform can pass on its own in some way. So, of course, a very, very hard thing to get through, something that Democrats and Republicans have tried to work on for years. The other thing to note is that the White House is saying this is on a list of other things that they want to get done, including voting rights, including policing reform, including abortion rights and protecting them. So this is really just another challenge for this White House that is facing a number of challenges.
The challenges just pile up. Yamiche Alcindor at the White House, Lisa Desjardins here in the studio. Thank you both.
All right. So again, a lot to unpack. I have a list of items that were brought up in the video. Let me just scroll to that. And as time will allow, we'll go through them one by one. But please don't let that deter you. If you have questions or comments on each one, please follow our standard practices to share those. Okay, so the first thing that you might be wondering, all right, I'm gonna get my documents open, is what is asylum? So I'm just gonna scroll through this list and then we can dig into conversation. So what is asylum? How does asylum help people fleeing persecution? What is the asylum application process? What happens to asylum seekers arriving at a US border? What are credible and reasonable fears, which factors into asylum when you're making an application? changes in the asylum process during the previous administration, and changes to the asylum process because of the pandemic that we still find ourselves in. So again, feel free to jump in, just put a question mark in the chat. So a lot of this information, and I'll drop the resource in just a moment, came from the American immigration site. So asylum is a protection granted to foreign nationals already in the United States or arriving at the border who meet the international law definition of a refugee. And that's from the United Nations 1951 Convention and the 1967 protocols. So what is in the asylum application process? There's two different ways to go about requesting asylum. The first is affirmative asylum. And that's a person who is not in removal proceedings, which is very important, may affirmatively apply for asylum through the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, also known as USCIS, a division of Homeland Security. If the USCIS asylum officer does not grant the asylum application, the applicant doesn't have a lawful immigration status, he or she is referred to immigration court for removal proceedings. Now, if you make it to removal proceedings, then you can apply for asylum with a defensive asylum application. So different than affirmative. So a person who is in removal proceedings may apply for asylum defensively by filing the application with the immigration judge at the Executive Office for Immigration Review in the Department of Justice. So how does that relate, and what, if any, bias is in the system of who gets approved for asylum, either by an affirmative asylum or defensive asylum? So I'm going to pause before we continue down the list and see if anyone would like to comment or ask questions.
Hi, Amy. I would just like to say the stark difference between the way the Haitians are being treated and the welcoming of the Afghanistan people is just so stark for me. And I would venture to say that the Afghans that are at Fort McCoy, and it looks as though there's 13,000 plus maybe, I would venture to say the US would offer some reasoning as that they were our allies, if you will, in the war against the Taliban, which they can look at in a very positive way and say they were soldiers, they were warriors, they, helped us fight the Taliban. But the difference is just so stark for me. And now it's just, I just keep seeing this. It's just such a visual that is heart-wrenching for me personally. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Sloan, for adding that. So as we continue to walk down our list, I think it's important to point out that a refugee is identified as a person who is unable or unwilling to return to his or her home country and cannot obtain protection in that country due to past persecution or a well-founded fear of being persecuted in the future. On the account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So in the deciphering of, do you fall under that identified, established category of refugee or not, who is making those decisions and what goes into if someone is designated with that status or not? I think it's something important to think about. When you look at reasonable fear, what did I have on the list? Credible fear versus reasonable fear. They're basically the same thing, but it's when you assign it. So for someone, it's their initial entry into the United States. They could say that they have a credible fear. For someone who has been not deported, but it removed. So if someone has been removed and is returning to the United States, then that's categorized as a reasonable fear. So I'll just read this from the site, and then I'll make sure I put that in the chat. It says individuals who re-enter the United States unlawfully after a prior removal order and non-citizens convicted of certain crimes are subject to a different expedited removal process called reinstatement or removal. Those in the reinstatement of removal processes who express a fear of returning to their country are afforded a reasonable fear interview with an asylum officer. So there's a slight difference between credible fear and reasonable fear there. Any comments before we move on to discuss changes in the asylum process at the border that happened under the recent previous administration? Oh, I see several in the chat, which makes me happy. Steve put a comment, also our welcoming of Cubans versus Haitians. Absolutely. Michelle, go ahead and unmute, and then we'll hear from Kendra.
Thank you. So a little while back in law school, I went down to the Texas border to represent people who were showing up at the border seeking asylum for about a week at one of the family detention centers down there. And I think when you talk about, Amy, like who makes these decisions about what, who has a credible fear, who falls into these categories, some of the main work that we did down there was, people who are being interviewed. So first of all, they're being interviewed by ICE agents at the border, Border Patrol. And they don't know, people coming to the country don't know the statutory guidelines that they have to meet to be able to qualify for asylum. So it's the people interviewing them trying to figure out, do they meet these guidelines to just move forward in the process? So a lot of the work that we were even doing was just, letting people know what information they needed to share. And usually the information that they needed to share that gave them the most fear of returning to their country is incredibly personal, incredibly traumatic. And, so we had to get them to be able to share those things, because that's the information that, might make them qualify for even just moving along in the process. So, and I guess if it's the government asking the questions, and in my personal opinion, they don't necessarily want everyone to be meeting the qualifications for asylum, they're not going to dig deeper and ask those questions when they're doing those interviews. So, I represented people who were first found to have not had a credible fear, but then we continued to fight that and say, no, actually they do. And we're able to get some decisions overturned. But I guess I just kind of wanted to make that point of like you said, Amy, the people determining, who makes that just first, or who crosses that first barrier of even just showing this credible fear at the border. It's not necessarily, it's certainly not people who are advocating for the people they're interviewing. It's the government, and they're certainly not going above and beyond to try to help people, try to get the information from people that is going to let them meet that standard. So I guess I just wanted to put that out there too. I personally think there's just so many more people who probably meet the baseline standards for asylum at the border, but we're just not getting that information.
Michelle, thank you so much for highlighting that. And in a little bit, we'll get to the backlog and the numbers and kind of some of the breakdowns. That'll bring us back to some of the points that you made. Thank you so much. Kendra, please unmute. Go ahead.
So Michelle actually answered a lot of my questions, and especially in terms of my questions were about, is it the person doing the interviewing that makes that subjective conclusion based on what the person says, and if there are any guidelines, but it sounds like there's also an interest in not accepting as many people as possible. So finding cause to turn people away. And that's what it sounds like how the process is set up, just from what Michelle said.
So the other point that I'll add to that is that every fiscal year, the president and Congress get together and kind of set caps on immigration and from which populations these people will be allowed to come from. And I will try to, I just saw it earlier today. I will try to go back and find that and then share my screen to show it. So thank you for making me think of that. But as we move forward in the conversation, if we just think about changes to the asylum process under the at the border during the Trump administration, and a lot of these policies are ongoing, so they are still into effect. So I will just highlight 3 of them. So in January 2019, DHS or Department of Homeland Security began implementing a series of new programs that have significantly altered the traditional credible and reasonable fear process once an asylum seeker is able to access that process. So there's getting to it, and now it has been altered. So the first of these programs is known as MPP, or Migrant Protection Protocols. And this forces asylum seekers to be sent back to Mexico, where they're required to wait for a date of their immigration court hearings held at 4 different US locations across the border. So that's one change. The other thing to note is that individuals put through the MPP, or again, Migrant Protection Protocols, do not go through the credible fear or reasonable fear screening process, but instead are put directly into court proceedings, which allow US officials to send them back to Mexico to wait to await their subsequent court hearings. What does that have to do with Haitian migrants? We'll get to that with the third one. The second change that I'll highlight is in July. Let me admit, Greg. All right. In July 2019, DHS issued a new rule banning asylum for all individuals who transitioned through a third country. I misspoke. We won't loop back to Haitians in the third one. We're going to do that right now. So now it's not just people coming from Mexico through the border, but any individual who transitioned through a third country before arriving in the United States. Well, what happened with the Haitian migrants? They came through Mexico to the Texas border. So without having applied for asylum in that country. So this goes back to what Michelle said. A lot of people who are fleeing persecution, who are fleeing some unconscionable conditions, don't necessarily know what our asylum practices and regulations are, let alone being able to apply for asylum before they make it to the United States. So I'm just going to start over from the beginning of that second one so we can process that together. So in July 2019, Department of Homeland Security issued a new rule banning asylum for all individuals who transition through a third country before arriving in the United States without having applied for asylum in that country. So under that rule, almost every person who arrived at the US-Mexico border for the first time after July 16th, 2019 is ineligible for asylum unless they had been subject to MPP, which was the first one we discussed, Migrant Protection Protocols, prior to that date. So I'm starting to get the sense that it might be complicated on purpose, but I could be wrong. And then the final one is that I'll highlight this evening is that in November 2019, DHS began implementing an asylum cooperative agreement. Well, what in the world is that? I'll tell you, with Guatemala specifically. So under this kind of agreement, which also is known as a safe third country agreement, individuals seeking asylum in the United States are instead sent to a third country and required to seek asylum there. Individuals subject to these agreements may not seek asylum or any other protection, including withholding of removal in the United States. So a similar agreement with Honduras went into effect in May 2020. The legalities of these agreements are currently under challenge and review. So that just gives you some of the changes that were implemented under the previous administration. And then the final thing before we move on that I want to discuss are changes to the asylum process due to COVID-19. So in March 2020, in response to the COVID-19 or coronavirus pandemic, the CDC issued an order suspending the introduction of persons who have been in coronavirus impacted areas. So the whole world was impacted by coronavirus, but who gets to decide what met the threshold of a coronavirus impacted area? Oh, I lost my spot. Give me 1 second. Okay, citing this authority, the Border Patrol began expelling individuals who arrived at the US-Mexico border without giving them the opportunity to seek asylum, even if they expressed a fear of persecution. Through April 2020, CBP reported that it has expelled nearly 21,000 people as a result of this new policy. So about a year and a half ago, 21,000 people have been turned away without even being offered the ability to request asylum. So the final section that I kind of want to go through is how long does the asylum process take? And that's kind of complicated as well. I've been doing a lot of talking. Neil, I see your hand up. Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to comment on the idea of passing through another country. And my recollection of reading about the Haitian asylum seekers was that many of them had gone from Haiti to Colombia, and then from Colombia to Mexico, I guess. And so they fall under that rubric of you can't come from another country but other than your own and still be a legitimate asylum seeker, which seems pretty strange, because if you are afraid, then you get out and go wherever you can go, and then try to decide what the next step is.
Right. And if you don't know the rule before you violated the rule, it's really difficult. So I just put in the chat the American Immigration Council website information, where a lot of the information that I just shared come from. There's tons more. I just kind of pulled some things that I thought would be relevant to our discussion. So please feel free to use that resource and do some additional exploration on your own. Is there anyone else who would like to share a comment either on the discussion that we've been having or any of the video clips that we viewed this evening? Janet, I see you waving. You go right ahead.
Besides the technicalities, which I think are just arbitrary, totally arbitrary, I was thinking back to the Hmong people who were allowed in because they were like the Afghanis. They helped the U.S. forces there, and Cubans come in, and then we have. I'm sure there are other groups, but then I was thinking about the comparison between those groups and the Haitians, and it strikes me that the Haitians have all kinds of strikes against them, including that they used to be slaves, and that they're Black, and I'm just wondering how much those factors are playing into this. We don't want you, because you can hear the discussion about these immigration protocols, but you can also see in the U.S. that we're short of laborers. So I don't think that makes a good comparison at all.
Thank you, Janet. Is there anyone else before we move on? All right, so also included on the American Immigration Council website that I just wanted to discuss briefly is how long does the asylum process take in general. So what I found was overall the asylum process can take years to conclude. In some cases, a person may file his or her application or pass a credible or reasonable fear screening and receive a hearing or interview date years in the future. Now, these are individuals that are not immediately deported, as is what happened in the case of the Haitian migrants, many of them. So as of September 2019, there were 339,836. I'll repeat that. 339,836 affirmative asylum applications pending. So remember, there's those two types. There's affirmative asylum and then there's defensive asylum. I didn't find the numbers on how many defensive asylum complaints were pending, but just the 339,836 affirmative sitting there. The government does not estimate the time it will take to schedule initial interviews for these asylum applicants, though historically they could reach 4 years. So the backlog in US immigration courts, which is another issue that we haven't delved into, reached an all-time high in April of 2020 with over 1.17 million open removal cases. So on average, these cases have been pending for 734 days and remain unsolved. Individuals with an immigration court case who are ultimately granted relief, such as asylum, by February 2020, had waited more than 930 days on average for that outcome. Side note, because Illinois is kind of close to us, Illinois and Virginia had the longest wait times, averaging 1,300 days until relief was granted in the immigration case. Now, juxtapose that with what we've just seen with the history of Saint-Domingue and how it became Haiti through the Haitian Revolution. These are people that have waited 900 days, 1,300 days. So why would Haitian refugees be immediately exported from our country, put on flights within days to clear out the space under and around the bridge? So just something to think about. I don't have the answer to that, but I am here to pose the question. So we've covered a lot. Oh, the other thing that I wanted is that the backlogs and delays can make it more difficult to, so let me back up. I had highlighted this. Okay. I'm going to paraphrase because I can't go exactly back to my notes where I had highlighted it. But keep in mind, and Michelle, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the asylum, entering into the asylum process does not automatically give you the right to legal counsel. So it's not like our American judicial system where you have the right to a public defender. So you are not guaranteed legal representation. And the other thing that I found is that the backlog and delays can make it more difficult to retain pro bono counsel because you just can't find people who are able to commit legal services for that extended period of time. If you're looking at a 930-day commitment, that's 3 years. If you're looking at a 1,300-day commitment into resolution of your case, that's a lot for someone who is doing pro bono work to stick with your case and to see it through and explain the process to you every step of the way. All right, I'm going to stop talking. I see that Ms. Glass has a question mark in the chat. Go ahead and unmute, please.
Hi. To answer your question, why was what the difference is with the Haitians being sent right back? It's simple. Their skin is black. Period.
Thank you, Ms. Glass. All right, Michelle put in the chat, yes, once you are allowed to formally apply for asylum, there are fees associated with the application. Michelle, thank you for bringing that up. I hadn't even addressed the fees associated. We were just doing the process, but absolutely. Can you give us a sense of how much those fees might be. And then we can also layer that on the people who were escaping Haiti. They literally had the clothes on their backs and the food that they could gather across the Mexican border. They were trying to cross that river, bringing it back to the camp. In a couple other clips that I didn't have the opportunity to share, they were saying that there wasn't enough food and supplies under the bridge, so they were forced to go back into Mexico to try to get those. And a lot of times people that they were dealing with would rob them of their money, etc. So then expecting people to have the financial wherewithal to support an asylum claim is oftentimes a bit of a stretch. But Michelle, if you could add to that, I would appreciate that.
I don't have updated information on the fees because they do change quite often. And I did my pro bono representation back in 2016, I think. But yeah, I think it's pretty rare to have legal counsel. And sorry if you can hear my 5-month-old crying in the background. My husband's here with her. It's challenging to have legal representation because no one can afford it. So I think you have to rely on the ability to get attorneys who can represent pro bono, law clinics, things like that. But I think typically people go unrepresented, and I mean, children go unrepresented. I think the most appalling case that we've heard of is, I want to say it was a 3-year-old in immigration court with no representation, and a judge just feeling like that's okay. So representation is a big issue. And I mean, I think the application, there's a few $100 fee, but there's fees that go along with other parts of it too. I'm trying to think of with asylum, if they can, someone had asked if they can apply to work. I think if their claim is deemed to have merit, they can apply for work authorization. Don't quote me on that one, but I think so. And then there's fees applied to that too, any kind of additional benefit you have to pay for. So that's what I can add.
No, don't apologize for your child. I heard it called last week, I think, parenting out loud. So you go ahead and parent out loud. I support that. So I went back to the same website and says asylum seekers and any family member waiting to, no, let me scroll down. Although asylum seekers may apply for work authorization after their case has been pending for 150 days or longer in some circumstances, the uncertainty of their future impedes employment, education, and trauma recovery opportunities. So it looks like, according to the information on the American Immigration Center website, you have to be here for at least 150 days before you can apply for work authorization. And then another thing is, if you are in the United States for over a year and you don't apply for asylum, that can be one of the things that bars you from seeking asylum. But again, if you don't know that rule, that makes that really challenging. So it's complicated. Jean put in there, what do those who are applying and waiting, where do they stay and what do they do? I would imagine it's different case by case, but if you are fortunate enough to have a family member in the United States that you can stay with pending the visitation of your asylum claim, but what if you are truly just escaping and don't have anywhere to go? I guess we could imagine if there are charities or shelters, etc., but that I don't have an answer to. All right, and Janet, it looks like you have a similar question. So we've discussed a lot this evening. I am going to stop talking for a minute. I'm going to pause. Is there any comments or feedbacks from any of the 3 video clips that we watched? I put each of those in the chat, so feel free to rewatch, hopefully to share them with others who are not able to be in the meeting this evening. Any comments or conversations on any of the topics that we've covered, specifically with Haitian immigration or immigration asylum law changes? Steve, looks like you have a question. Go ahead and unmute, please.
Just a quick comment on the NGOs that are working in Haiti. This is a little bit tangential, but there are a whole lot of Americans as well as European organizations, setting up clinics, setting up orphanages, setting up churches. The problem with that is oftentimes they end up competing with one another rather than cooperating. And the Haitians will also play the Americans, one church against another or something like that, simply to get funds for their orphanage or for their school or for their clinic or whatever. The challenge that brings is when you don't have a government able to provide sanitation, water, sanitation, electricity, it ends up hurting those efforts rather than working together with them. And, so it just becomes a very complex problem. There's no wonder why people want to flee. There are the gangs, I'm sure everyone's seen in the news a recent 16 or 17 missionaries that are being held for ransom. And that kind of reality, it just so much chaos, so much lack of centralized control or government or organization that it just compounds things tremendously.
Steve, thank you for that. I would encourage anyone who would like additional information to definitely go back to the site. I was just scanning through it, and there's a section that says what happens to asylum seekers while their application is being processed. So I'll just read a couple excerpts from it. It said asylum seekers include some of the most vulnerable members of society: children, single mothers, victims of domestic violence or torture, and other individuals who have suffered persecution and trauma. So then it goes on to talk about how the U.S. has argued that it has the right to detain such individuals rather than release them into communities. And some courts have rejected that interpretation and held that asylum seekers meeting certain criteria have a right to a bond hearing. And advocates challenge the practice of detaining asylum applicants without providing a meaningful opportunity to seek parole, including class action, et cetera, suits for prolonged detention. So there, again, I think it depends on who is hearing your initial case, whether you will be detained, whether you will have the right to go and then come back for your hearings, et cetera. All right, Michelle, please go ahead and unmute.
Well, so I guess along those lines too, a lot of, at least like I said, back when I was doing some of the hearings, a lot of people were released on electronic monitoring bracelets too. But from what I remember, the numbers being back then, it was a huge percentage of people, and I know that's not scientific, but I don't remember the percentage. I wanted to say it was like in the 90% of people who are released who show up for their hearings, because you'll hear the argument of, well, if they're released into the United States, they're not going to show up, but people want their chance to have legal status here. So the number of people who were released showed up, whether or not they had electronic monitoring on. But the other thing I wanted to say was just, when we have these conversations about immigration, I think we so often hear that idea of, well, people should apply the legal way or come the legal way. And I just wanted to point out that, like you said, Amy, at the beginning, showing up at the border and seeking asylum, asking for asylum is a legal way. I mean, that's in the statute. That's a legal way to seek admission to our country. And the other legal ways, like you mentioned about the numbers, are, I mean, in my opinion, they're effectively non-existent. The amount of time you'd have to wait to apply without just showing up at the borders, I mean, it's effectively not going to give anyone a chance to escape the things they're trying to escape, or even just to apply for immigration in general. If you had family here, some of those wait lists from different countries are 20 years long. So that's just, I think, another thing to keep in mind. For one, that showing up at the border is a legal way to do it. And for two, other legal ways have become so complicated that they're effectively non-existent anymore.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that. So final thing that I will leave us with before we shift over to announcements, etc. Is you may be thinking at this point, hopefully you're thinking, so who in the world gets asylum? It's kind of seems like the golden ticket and who gets it. So I'm going to share my screen briefly. All right. So this is for the, and remember I said that there are different caps set every fiscal year of how many people can immigrate to the United States, and that's in conjunction with the president and Congress kind of set those levels. So for this one, we have the information for the fiscal year of 2018, and I know it may appear very small on your screen, so I will read it. So we'll start with the second largest chunk and kind of work our way around clockwise. So 18% of asylum seekers, let me back up so you know 18% of what. All right, so in fiscal year 2018, the most recent year with available data, 38,687 individuals were granted asylum, okay? So the most recent year that we have data was 2018. And that fiscal year, it was just under 39,000 people, okay? And remember I said there were those two different times. It's affirmative or defensive asylum. So 25,439 affirmatively and 13,248 defensively. So we can scroll down now. All right, so in the year 2018, 18% of those who received asylum were from the People's Republic of China, 16% from Venezuela, 8% from El Salvador, 6% from Guatemala, 5% from Honduras, 4% from Egypt, 3% from Mexico, 3% from India, 2% from Russia, 2% from Syria, and 2% from Pakistan. And then all other countries combined included 31% of people who were granted asylum, okay? So I will stop sharing, but just keep in mind that seeking asylum is separate from traditional immigration. So you want to come on a student visa, a work visa, etc. But those are just extreme cases of I am fleeing from something and looking to come to the United States. So those are the asylum numbers. So before I yield the floor for announcements, are there any final thoughts or concerns that others would like to share? Thank you everyone for joining us. Vicky is putting a thanks in there, appreciate that. Kendra, go ahead and unmute, please.
Do they give a breakdown on the numbers of those who apply and where they're from, and then how many of those that apply from those different areas get granted asylum?
For the applications, yes, I remember seeing that this morning when I was doing some last minute digging. I did not come across those applications disaggregated by race, but that doesn't mean that those disaggregations don't exist. But the thing I would caution you when looking at that data is under the changes to the asylum protocols under the Trump administration, and then the emergency protocols that were put in place under COVID-19, so many individuals are not even reaching the point where they can apply for asylum. So I would just say to keep that in mind for any asylum applications that you're looking at. Those like the MPP protocols and the other two things that I highlighted, which were recent changes, those all happened prior to the asylum application process. So hopefully that was helpful. All right, we have arrived at 6:51. Neil, I'm going to yield the floor to you first while I pull up a separate screen. Are there any announcements for DAT?
I once again am yielding the floor to Jean Carfora, who knows more about it than I do. So She will tell you about December's program for DAT.
Okay, well, I just want to say that our last program in October was an excellent one with delving into disabilities. In November, Neil, we're going to have one November 19th, and we're planning to have that in person at Hedberg Public Library, and that will be sponsored by the Allies of Native Nations, a branch of our DAT, and it will be focusing on boarding schools. And then in December, we're going to have an outstanding program. Cameron Mirza, member of DAT, and Dr. Ronald Watson from Beloit College will be focusing on minority defense. And I'll read the title so you have a better idea. How racialized violence created the Black Panther Party, Young Lords, and American Indian movement. So we're delving into history there, and I know it's going to be an excellent program. And we're not sure right now if that'll be Zooming or at Hedberg Public Library in person.
Thank you, Jean. I love that you refer to it as Zooming. So I just added in the chat a documentary on the Haitian Revolution, which I thought about trying to squeeze in. It's really good. It's just under an hour, but I put that link in there and it goes into it. Okay, so I will give a content warning. Some of the depictions are pretty not necessarily graphic, but are brutal. So just wanted to give a content warning there, but it's really good. And it talks about the splitting of Santo Domingo and Sandoval, and how that became Haiti, and et cetera. So it goes into a lot of the 12-year revolution. And keep in mind, which I think we heard in the second clip, a lot of the people that began this revolution did not know each other and had only been in the same physical space for 2 to 3 years. So the level of organization that was required to be successful in this undertaking, there's layers to it. So please go ahead and watch that if your schedule permits. I have the same announcement that I will have until November 4th. I'm going to share my screen. We are excitedly preparing for our 7th annual Racial Justice Conference. If you use the link that I provided in the chat, it will take you to this screen. Our theme this year is Be the Bridge to Eliminate Racism, Small Steps Create Big Changes. We are just doing our last minute adjustments and fine tuning. I am really excited for the conference this year. I think it, again, is going to be a very quality product. I think you're going to learn so much. We are out of the early bird registration window. So registration right now costs $125. Let me stop sharing so I can see everyone. We are fortunate to have several sponsors. So if you work for an organization that is a sponsor of our conference, please register through them because you will be able to get a discounted rate. But otherwise, if you are paying for your own, look at it as an investment in your personal education. So the price right now is $125. If you know of a student that is interested in participating, student tickets are $50. Doesn't matter if they register day of conference. Hopefully they won't wait that late. If for any reason you do not want to go through the website, you can also contact Georgine Hunt at YWCA Rock County. You can pay with credit or debit card over the phone. She can invoice you if you need to purchase multiple tickets, or you can submit a check. So any questions about the conference? We have about 4 minutes left. I would be happy to entertain those.
I don't have a question about the conference, but I just put something in the chat, which is not officially from DAT, but from me as a part of the League of Women Voters DEI committee, we were told about a program that is sponsored by the Dane County United Way, which is a 21 session program on DEI. And DEI means diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Audubon Society, National Audubon Society, puts a B at the end of that for belonging, which I think is a good idea. Anyway, you can go, I hope, to this link and click on it and see what the different sessions are. And they will even send you a reminder each week for the session that you've registered for. So I think it's a helpful tool. It's one more thing to do, but if we want to keep learning, it's there for us to do.
Thank you so much for including that. And I love that it's not a 21-day challenge, which is the recommended length of time it takes to form a habit. This is a 21-week challenge. So it started at the end of August. I want to say August 30th. I am doing this every Monday. They send you information and it runs through Monday, January 17th, which if you celebrate Dr. King, which will be just in time to honor his birthday. Preliminary, we are having a meeting on Thursday for potentially organizing an MLK Jr. commemoration event virtually again this year. We're going to try to get the band back together. So if you are interested in being a part of that effort, please go ahead and put that in the chat and I will include you on Thursday's invite. If you are interested and you just can't make, we're meeting Thursday at 4 virtually and you can't make it, please indicate that and that will include you on future meetings.
I want to say about the United Way thing, even though it started back in August, you can come into it at any point. That is to say, you don't have to start in the middle. You can, even though it started back when, you can start at the beginning and take the 21-week program. You just end later than everybody else. I hope that's right. I think so.
I think it's fine. In worst case scenario, just talk to someone who's been in from the beginning and hopefully they can forward you the resources so you can work at your own pace. The point is, take the initiative to self-educate, immerse yourself in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think we will all be better for it. We have arrived at 6:59, which I think is pretty good timing. We definitely want to be respectful of everyone's time and start and end on time. Hopefully you see this evening as a great use of your time. Feel free to spread the word. Oh, so for our November meeting, we will be having part 2 where we will be discussing immigration, but we're going to bring it to a local focus. So thank you so much for your comments, your questions, your lived experience and being willing to share that with us. So for our November Courageous Conversation, we're going to continue with immigration, but talking about the local focus and impact. All right, it looks like my partner has stepped away. So I will officially open the parking lot. I will end the recording